Hello, I'm Recky J, and welcome back for, well, it's not really history, but what the hell is going on between Russia and the Ukraine? A lot of things going on. I know Sweden is preparing to defend themselves for something, and always point our fingers at Russia. But what does Russia need and wants from the Ukraine? I think a lot of people have asked themselves that question. And I found a video over by the same guy I just found is History with Hilbert. And we're going to find out exactly what the hell is going on. And hopefully, by the end of the video, we know exactly what's going on. It's a bit long, but we're going to push through because we want to know. And of course, if you do enjoy, smack the like. And of course, if you want to become a wrecker, well, hit subscribe. And before we go ahead and watch the video, we thank the supporters of Recky J. And we start with the channel members. Thank you guys. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And we have the Patreons. Huge list in my eyes. Awesome support. And we have the Supreme Tier donators over by Patreon. Sean Pearson, Buddha Squirrel, and David Bankson. And they get an awesome postcard from Recky with a personal message. After 2 months. That's kind of neat, isn't it? Well, let's find out what's going on between Russia and Ukraine. I have no clue.
Ukraine is the second largest country in Europe, following Russia, a country which it borders to the north and east, and with which it has recently been in conflict. Russian troops, numbering around 130,000 men, are poised on several of Ukraine's borders, sparking fears that Russia will attempt an invasion of its neighbour in the coming weeks. The international community and the government of Ukraine have engaged in several rounds of talks with Russia, which to date have not yet resolved tensions between the two.
So basically what we can watch for 29 seconds, and there's something Russia. I'm not sure the people wants it, but I'm thinking that they need something from Russia.
But how did we end up at this point? It will be very hard to summarize this all in a video that isn't many hours long. But in this one, I want to give some kind of background as to the tension between Ukraine and Russia, and also the complex internal dynamics in Ukraine itself. This is History of Today, the Russo-Ukrainian conflict.
I love that. History of today. Not yesterday. Today. This is happening right now.
But before getting into that, a quick word from today's video sponsor, Wren. Wren is a public benefit company launched in 2019 with a mission to unlock the collective action of individuals against the climate crisis. Now, if you're like me and you watch the news, then you'll notice that the climate situation has been talked about a lot and that we all need to do something about it.
Yep.
And Wren is a great way to do just that. A simple and effective way to make a difference, Wren is a website where you can calculate your own carbon footprint and then offset it by funding a diverse mix of different carbon reduction projects such as tree planting, mineral weathering and rainforest protection. And since 2019, Wren has raised over $1 million for these causes. When you sign up and make a monthly contribution to offset your own carbon footprint, you'll also receive monthly updates from the projects that you support so you can see where your money's actually going and how it's helping to contribute to combating climate change. Offset your carbon footprint today. The first 100 people who sign up using the link in the description will have 10 extra trees planted in their name. So go ahead, check it out and do something good today.
Wow, we got part one. So I'm thinking if 32 minutes, which is in the entire video, if that's part one, we're gonna watch it. But if there's some reason it's divided in two parts, we're gonna do part one today and do part two the next time. The Wild Fields, 1600, 1917. Holy crap, we're going back. We're going back.
To understand the current situation unfolding in Eastern Europe, we must first cast our eyes back in time to what is a very complex and often politicized history. In fact, some of the very earliest history behind the Russo-Ukrainian conflict goes all the way back to the Viking Age, Kievan Rus, which I talked about in this video. For the purpose of time, however, we're going to start with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which for much of the Renaissance period dominated most of what is now Ukraine. While many of the nobility were Polonized and waves of Polish peasants migrated and mingled with the local population, some of the native Ruthenian peasants took up arms in order to maintain their culture and their Eastern Orthodox faith. They became known as Cossacks and would be used by both the Poles and their oftentimes enemies, the Russians.
Cossacks is really cool. That's basically the only thing I know so far. Well, we're just 3 minutes in, Recky. We never know what you actually know. But I do know a lot about Cossacks, and they look fantastic. I love that uniform.
Russian Tsardom as crack mercenaries. This situation changed when between 1772 and 1795, the ailing Commonwealth was partitioned by the neighbouring powers, eventually becoming subsumed by Prussia, Austria, and Russia. In what is now Ukraine, this resulted in the extreme west being incorporated into the Austro-Hungarian Empire, while the central and eastern regions were fully dominated by the Russians. In the south, where the Crimean Khanate had once been the last vestige of the Golden Horde, the Ottoman Turks were slowly pushed out of the region by Russia. The Cossack rebellions continued.
Wait a minute. Wait a minute. So you're telling me that the Ukraine was a part of Russia in the late 1700s. We're talking about Lebensraum here again, right?
Now aimed largely at Russian authority, which many argue led to the development of a separate Ukrainian identity to that of the Russians further east. Many Ukrainian nationalists and intellectuals also fled those areas under Russian administration to seek safe haven in the Austrian West. When the First World War came around in 1914, it would split what is now Ukraine between the Central Powers aligned West and the Entente aligned Russian East. As the Tsardom faced catastrophe on the battlefield, the Bolsheviks took their chance and revolted in 1917, kickstarting the Russian Revolution. Inside Ukraine, the long-suppressed nationalists, but also Ukrainian Bolsheviks, anarchists, Poles, and others would all take up arms, and they turned the country into a patchwork of warring states.
Wow. Wow. Okay. That's a lot of information just by the first 5 minutes here. The Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, 1917 to 1991. Man.
Eventually, they would all be brought to heel by the Red Army, and in 1922, the Ukrainska Radyanska Socialistyczna Respublika, or Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic,
Damn, I bet your ass that was a perfect pronunciation, really.
Became the sole power as one of the constituent republics of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR. The Donbass, an area around the Donetsk basin, had a mixed population of ethnic Russians and ethnic Ukrainians, but was ceded to the Ukrainian SSR upon its inception. Throughout the Ukrainian SSR, nationalists were jailed, as were any who opposed the party line as dictated by Moscow. Times were hard, and soon after its inception, the Ukrainian SSR had its first taste of Soviet-style land reform. What followed was dekulakization, in which the relatively well-off peasant class, the kulaks, were systematically deported, executed, and starved to death. Hundreds of thousands died.
I'm getting really fed up with hearing how people can treat other people. It's really getting to me, to be honest. There's one line in the movie Fury. Wait till you see what a man can do to another man.
And then the resulting famine broke out. Millions died. Known as the Holodomor, this terror famine has since been viewed as a genocide by over 16 countries. The next great calamity for the region would be the German invasion of the USSR in June of 1941.
The Soviets had invested heavily in industrialization, particularly in western Ukraine, which was soon captured by the German advance. Some Ukrainians viewed the Germans as liberators. They were, after all, subject to draconian Soviet rule, and many Ukrainians fought alongside the Axis and even served as concentration camp guards and executioners in neighboring Poland. Others became partisans and fought against the German occupiers in hit-and-run attacks alongside elements of the Red Army. A final group, the Ukrainska Povstanska Armia, or Ukrainian Insurgent Army, fought both the Germans, the Soviets, and the Polish Home Guard in an attempt to make an independent Ukrainian state.
Holy crap.
Eventually, the Soviet Red Army would recapture all of Ukraine. At the war's end in 1945, the Crimean Peninsula, which had until that time been an autonomous republic of the USSR, much like the Ukrainian SSR itself, was incorporated directly into the Russian SFSR. 9 years later, in 1954, however, the Crimean Oblast was gifted to the Ukrainian SSR, thus becoming a part of Ukraine at the time. The reason for this decision being given as economic concerns, with trade being largely with the Ukrainian SSR as opposed to the Russian SFSR, as well as those of territorial proximity and cohesion. Crimea was incredibly important for the Russians, particularly the port city of Sevastopol, where the Soviet Black Sea
Hey, wait a
Fleet
minute.
was
He is saying that really cool, right? I bet he gotta be Russian or something.
stationed, as its harbour is one of the only warm deep-water harbours on the Black Sea and Sea of Marmara coasts available to them. Along with the other Warsaw Pact countries in Central and Eastern Europe, Ukraine served as a strategic buffer for Russia between itself and the NATO countries in the West.
Good one. I like this one. You can take the Ukraine out of the USSR, but 1991.
By the late 80s, the first serious cracks were appearing in the Iron Curtain, and by 1991, years of failing economic reforms under Gorbachev signaled the end of an era for the USSR. Following the failure of a hardline communist coup in Moscow, a growing number of republics began declaring their independence. At the end of 1991, the Russian SFSR, the Belarusian SSR, and the Ukrainian SSR announced the formal dissolution of the USSR, becoming respectively the Russian Federation, the Republic of Belarus, and Ukraine. Ukraine
I gotta go back.
under Gorbachev signaled the end of an era for the USSR.
Okay.
Following the failure of a hardline communist coup in Moscow, a growing number of republics began declaring their independence.
Okay.
At the end of 1991, the Russian SFSR, the Belarusian SSR, and the Ukrainian SSR announced the formal dissolution of the USSR, becoming respectively the Russian Federation, the Republic of Belarus, and Ukraine.
Wow.
Ukraine held an independence referendum on leaving the USSR. While the pro-secession campaign received around 92% of the vote, with a voter turnout of 84%, there are several areas worth highlighting for their relatively high proportion of no voters, that is, voters who wanted to remain in the USSR alongside Russia. In Crimea, the no vote was just under half, at 42%. While the independently registered city of Sevastopol turned out at 39%. Only 60% of voters turned out in Crimea. Voter turnout was also around 65% in the eastern Kharkiv and Donetsk oblasts, as well as in the Odessa oblast to the west of Crimea. Voter turnout was 68% in the eastern Luhansk oblast. An interesting
I gotta say, I'm holding on to every word he says. He is fantastic. He has the power to captivate me, even though he's just talking about percentage voter numbers and stuff like that. But he has the power of actually pulling you into the information. I'm hanging on to every word here.
Correlation can be observed when superimposing regions in which Russian is spoken as a native language by a majority of the population. which according to a 2001 census is spoken as a native language by around 30% of Ukraine's population, some 14 million people. Some 20% of those asked in a different 2012 poll answered they considered both Russian and Ukrainian as their native language. While language need not be a direct...
I'm going to say I wouldn't probably hear the difference between the Ukrainian language and the Russian language. I would probably not hear the difference in that. Maybe Russians and Ukrainians couldn't hear the difference between Swedish and Danish.
Direct indicator of national allegiance, or much less of nationality itself.
Wow, look at
It
that.
is interesting to note parallels between political sentiment, national identity, and language, as these do often, but not always, go together. Russian President Vladimir Putin has frequently spoken about his responsibility for Russians in Ukraine, even stating that Ukrainians and Russians were the same people outright. In the years that followed the creation of a separate Ukrainian state, much of this affiliation with Russia would continue, and even begin to grow as the government in Kiev was faced with increasing challenges.
Wow, I like this. And if you like it too, smack the like and hit that subscribe. Independent Ukraine, 1991 to 2013.
By 2001, a decade after the fall of the USSR, the view of Europe looked increasingly dismal for Moscow. Several former Warsaw Pact countries such as Poland, Hungary and the Czech Republic had already joined NATO. They would be joined several years later by the Baltic states, Slovakia, Slovenia, Bulgaria and Romania. The expansion of the USSR's traditional enemy, NATO, as well as the economic and increasingly political power of the EU, greatly worried Moscow, who was steering away from closer cooperation with the West under Putin's leadership. The new Russian Federation's relationship with independent Ukraine started amicably enough, with close ties between them for much of the 90s. A possible point of contention was solved in 1994 when Ukraine did away with its nuclear arsenal left behind by the Soviets. In exchange, Russia promised to militarily aid Ukraine should its territorial sovereignty be impinged upon. Ukraine also leased the use of the deep-water harbour in Sevastopol to the Russian Navy, thus making the port city the home of both the Russian and Ukrainian fleets.
Wow.
However, the steady relations were not to last. Throughout the 2000s, there were disputes about gas, as well as the failed Russian
I heard about the dispute with the gas.
plan to integrate Ukraine into...
But I couldn't probably say this is the reason why there was a conflict about gas. What I do remember, I'm not sure, correct me if I'm wrong, is that Ukraine imported gas from Russia
to a single economic space. Worse for the Russians was the increasing cooperation between Ukrainian President Viktor Yushchenko and the West. This came following the 2004 Orange Revolution, when mass protests forced a recount of a heavily rigged election in which the pro-Russian candidate Viktor Yanukovych was denied the presidency. Ukrainian troops made up the third largest contingent of soldiers sent to Iraq in 2004, as well as being a significant force involved in peacekeeping in Kosovo. Ukraine made a bid to join NATO in 2008, thus further alienating the Russians. In turn,
Yeah, I do know that Russia really don't care for NATO.
Russian foreign policy towards Ukraine turned increasingly to countering pro-Western sentiment and smearing its proponents while backing pro-Russian candidates. The 2008-9 financial crisis hit Ukraine hard. The economy fell by 15%, and further disputes
15?
resulted in Russia closing gas pipelines into the country until they were resolved. Things started to look up for Russia
So they closed the gas.
when in 2010, Viktor Yanukovych, born in the Stalino Oblast in the far east of Ukraine's Donbass region, was elected to power. One of his stated aims was to introduce Russian as the second state language of Ukraine alongside Ukrainian, resulting in a bill which made any regional language spoken by a minority of more than 10% an official language in that area. He extended the lease of Sevastopol, due to end in 2017, ensuring that the Russian fleet could remain stationed there until 2042. In late 2013, he rejected an EU association deal and chose for closer economic ties with Russia, including a loan bailout. Together with allegations of press censorship and a crackdown on corruption many claimed was a politically motivated witch hunt against his opponents, the seeds of unrest were sown in Ukraine.
Wow, this might actually be one of the best ones when it comes to history today and information that is given. Ukrainian Spring 2013 to 2014.
Understanding the earlier history and demographics is important to understanding the current conflicts raging within Ukraine for several reasons. They're particularly helpful in providing context for the often huge regional differences within the country when it comes to Russia and the West. The western and central regions of Ukraine are far more in favor of closer ties with the West, ostensibly the EU and NATO, and are more hostile towards Russia. The growing ties of President Yanukovych with Russia, among other internal factors, boiled over in several Ukrainian cities, but especially the capital Kiev, towards the end of November in 2013. Starting on Maidan Nezalezhnosti, Independence Square in Kiev. The initial trigger was the rejection of a long-awaited European Union-Ukraine Association Agreement, though the demands of the protesters soon increased in scope to rooting out government corruption, which was rife, the abuse of power, human rights violations, and finally the toppling of the president himself. The Euromaidan protests, as they became known, had devolved into fierce street battles in Kiev by the middle of February 2014.
I remember this. It was very brutal when it comes to the civilians and the government. I'm gonna say army, government police, police and government personnel. It was pretty brutal.
It's likely that several hundred people were killed in clashes between authorities and protesters.
Recky?
From late November to late February, though they achieved their goal of impeaching Yanukovych and signing the EU Association Agreement. Snap elections were held with Petro Poroshenko gaining 54.7% of the votes and thus becoming the next Ukrainian president. As the debris and the bodies were cleared from Kiev's Independence Square, many might have believed that the worst for Ukraine was behind it. But this was only...
There was only beginning. $2014, something. Keep blim.
As much of western and central Ukraine celebrated the success of the Ukrainian Revolution, ousted President Yanukovych went first to Odessa and from there to Crimea, before going into exile in Russia. The people he encountered on his flight from Ukraine were likely equally displeased at his removal from power. Anti-Ukrainian demonstrations had been held in Crimea in 2008, the height of Russo-Ukrainian tensions the previous decade, as well as calls by the local government of Crimea for incorporation into Russia, by military means if necessary. While the Euromaidan protests were still ongoing in early February of 2014, the Presidium of the Supreme Council voiced support for holding a referendum on the peninsula's status and asked the Russian government to manage the vote. This was treated as a criminal case by the Security Service of Ukraine and investigated as an act of subversion. Russian politicians figured that with the pro-Western sentiment expressed by the now victorious Euromaidan protesters, the new lease agreement signed by Yanukovych for use of the harbour at Sevastopol might well be overturned. In Crimea, as well as will be seen in the extreme east of Ukraine, there were fears that extremist militias from the west would arrive to stamp out any pro-Russian sentiment, which led to the creation of several people's militias. On the 26th of February, there were confrontations between pro-Russian demonstrators and largely ethnic minority Crimean Tatars in support of the Euromaidan protests. The following day, the Little Green Men arrived. Commandos in unmarked green uniforms seized government buildings and erected barricades outside them in Simferopol, planting white, blue, red flags above their impromptu checkpoints. These were Russian special forces, and they would be joined by equally masked Russian regular forces who established roadblocks along the Perekop Isthmus, joining Crimea.
Look at that. They're just standing there with M60. I'm pretty sure it's a Russian weapon. I can't see. It looks like it looked like an M60. It could definitely be like something like that. Both have them. That's an insane cross set. Or check line, or whatever you want to call it, checkpoint.
To the rest of Ukraine. By early March, Russian troops were barricading Ukrainian naval bases and began demanding the surrender of the forces inside. All this occurred without any official declaration of war, with Russian officials denying there were any Russian troops operating inside Ukraine aside from local self-defense forces. When they did eventually admit to a Russian presence in Crimea, they claimed they were comprised of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, acting in order to prevent threats to the lives of Crimean civilians and to counter a takeover by extremists. On the 16th of March, Russian forces, in cooperation with the Supreme Council of Crimea, presided over a referendum on whether Crimea would become autonomous or would retain its position in Ukraine, something the Ukrainian court declared illegal. Yep. Officials claimed that 83% of Crimeans turned out to vote, secession being chosen by 95.5% of voters. These results have been questioned, as well as the circumstances of how the vote was held and the legality of the vote in the first place. On the 17th of March, the Council declared the Autonomous Republic of Crimea as an independent nation.
Wow.
The following day, the breakaway republic was admitted into Russia as the Republic of Crimea. While de facto under Russian control, Crimea is still internationally recognized as belonging to Ukraine. The day before the referendum, Russian troops massed on Ukraine's eastern border, likely in order to cow any Russian response. And it is to the east that we must now pay our attention for the next step in the story.
Yeah, 2014.
Throughout February and continuing with greater intensity the following month, large pro-Russian and after the change of leadership anti-Ukrainian government protests were held. In the oblasts of Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporizhia, Mykolaiv, Kherson and Odessa, these stayed at the level of street protests, while the Russian occupation of Crimea prompted further action in the eastern oblasts. In the city of Donetsk, protesters stormed and held the regional state administration building from the 1st to the 6th of March, demanding a similar referendum on succession from Ukraine as was held in Crimea, before they were forced out by Ukrainian security forces. Then, a month later, on the 6th of April, in the cities of Kharkiv, Luhansk and Donetsk, regional state administration buildings were stormed, and the following day in Donetsk, the protesters declared the Donetsk People's Republic. The same day, the Kharkiv People's Republic was declared, but would be stamped out within a fortnight following a rapid response by Ukrainian security forces. On the 27th of April, the Luhansk People's Republic.
It feels like there was 100 years ago this conflict was going on in a country. It feels so weird to say that this was just a few years ago. It was 2014, and it just amazes me that it's still going on.
Republic was also declared. So what had changed since the previous month for pro-Russian demonstrators to seize power in eastern Ukraine? In a word, Crimea. While Russia's annexation of the peninsula was seen as a clear victory for Moscow, it had the unintended consequence of shifting the balance of opinion against Russia in the hearts and minds of many Ukrainians. Formerly sympathetic citizens were now viewing their eastern neighbour as an aggressor. In terms of its political dynamic, with the loss of the pro-Russian voting bloc of Crimea and Sevastopol, the pendulum which had been balanced for decades now swung in favour of anti-Russian or pro-Western sentiment. Some ethnic Russians, Russian speakers, or pro-Russian Ukrainians in the East feared reprisals from vengeful Westerners. The successful annexation by Russia gave those in Donbass hope that the same might be possible there. Pro-Russian militants and defecting law enforcement agents battled police across the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, capturing the cities of Slavyansk, Mariupol, Kharkivka, Kramatorsk, Yenakieva, Makivka, Drashkivka, and Zhdanivka. In response, the interim Ukrainian government launched the anti-terrorist operation, the first action of which was the attack on Slavyansk on the 13th of April, after it had fallen to the insurgents the day before. Given the weakened state of Ukrainian administration and the army following the unrest and division in the country, a mainstay of the war in Donbass would be the use of paramilitary groups by the Ukrainian army. Controversially, some of these groups, such as the Azov Battalion from November 2014, part of the Ukrainian National Guard, as well as the Right Sector, are strongly affiliated with ultra-nationalist and neo-Nazi organizations. The Right Sector uses the same black and red banner used by the UKA during the Second World War.
Wow. There's so much information here. I'm loving it. I love to be up to speed with what's going on. I love history. This is current affairs. It just amazes me that we're still here today. We're going on for the last 5 minutes to see if we can understand what's going on.
Who helped to purge Polish people in an ethnic genocide. These affiliations have been used by the insurgents as evidence that their taking up arms was in self-defense against...
That is not to justify any action taken due to this claim, only to provide the necessary context behind it for the sake of objectivity. Not all units of the Ukrainian armed forces or independent militias are affiliated with extremist groups. In several cases, the links between ultra-nationalists, political parties, and movements and militia groups isn't entirely clear.
An extremist-run Ukrainian government. The pro-Russian insurgents had captured many weapons from police and arsenals in the territories they took, and the People's Militias, as they became called, became the mainstay of their fighting forces. They were, however, led by former GRU, that is to say, Russian military intelligence agents Igor Girkin and Igor Betzler. The Ukrainian forces also mounted attacks against Kramatorsk and Mariupol, which, along with Slavyansk, would be wrested from separatist control from May to July of 2014. It later came to light that during this period of fighting, several pro-Ukrainian journalists and civil servants were tortured and killed by the insurgents. On the 12th of May, following a referendum, Igor Girkin declared himself the supreme commander of the Donetsk People's Republic. Meanwhile, there were pro- and anti-separatist rallies inside the self-declared republics. There was also infighting between several factions of pro-Russian insurgents within their territory. Multiple attempts to maintain ceasefires between the rebels and Ukraine failed, and the military and civilian death count continued to rise. A July offensive by the Ukrainian military saw the cities of Droshkivka, Kostyanyivka, Siversk, and Artemievsk fall to their advance and prepared to push into the rebel stronghold capitals of Donetsk and Luhansk. By late August, Ukrainian troops were pushing through the suburbs of Luhansk city block by block, with attacks well underway against Makiivka and Ilvaisk, the two cities outside Donetsk.
Must be the last part, this one. 2014 to 2022.
But the insurgents counterattacked with the help of a large number of Russian regular and irregular forces fighting without official insignia. Some estimates claim that anywhere between 15 to 80% of insurgent forces fighting in the Donbass are Russian military. On the 5th of September, the governments of Ukraine, Russia, and the two breakaway republics signed the Minsk Protocol, agreeing to a ceasefire. Prisoner exchanges would take place and heavy weaponry would be removed from the front. However, by October, the peace was breaking down. Violent clashes broke out and the DPR and the LPR held elections, contrary to what had been agreed. In the first days of 2015, the fighting escalated further. The death knell for the first Minsk agreement being tolled by the rebel capture of Donetsk International Airport after a bloody siege lasting 3 months on the 15th of January. A new ceasefire agreement was signed on the 11th of February, the Minsk II agreement, though insurgent forces still assaulted and captured Debaltseve. Artillery was withdrawn from the front lines by the end of the month by both sides, and the fighting ground down to a stalemate fought along an entrenched line of control. By the middle of 2015, the war in Donbass was labelled a frozen conflict, with small-scale losses every day and no major territorial changes occurring. In all of 2016, Ukraine lost no more territory to insurgent forces, and the casualty count was significantly lower than it had been in 2014 and 2015. At the start of 2017, there was heavy fighting around the Ukrainian-controlled city of Avdiivka. Several ceasefires failed to be held throughout the year. Ukraine officially ended its anti-terrorist operation on the 30th of April 2018, replacing it with the Joint Forces Operation, to signify the fact that Ukrainian forces were operating against elements of the Russian military as opposed to domestic insurgents. On the 31st of August 2018, the leader of the DPR, Alexander Zakharchenko, was killed in an explosion whilst eating at a restaurant in Donetsk. Russia and the separatist republics blamed the Ukrainian government, whilst Ukraine claimed it came as a result of separatist infighting inside the republic. In October of 2019, a new round of talks in the Normandy format involving France, Germany, Ukraine and Russia suggested the reintegration of Donetsk and Luhansk into Ukraine with special status, something that, when polled by the Center for East European and International Studies the previous March, 55% of those in rebel territories were in favor of. Since the establishment of a new ceasefire in July 2020 to November, Ukrainian combat losses decreased tenfold. However, the number of dead increased sharply in the first 3 months of 2021. In March and April of that year, the largest Russian troop movements along the Ukrainian border since the annexation of Crimea in 2014 took place, sparking fears of a Russian invasion. While these troops did pull back after taking part in military exercises, the mass buildup of Russian force here again at the end of 2021 and still as it currently stands in January 2022, it's certainly cause for concern for Ukraine and her allies.
A coming war 2022.
While active conflict in the east of Ukraine might have cooled, tensions between the Ukrainian and Russian governments has remained high, and never more so than in recent months when the threat of invasion and war has loomed large. Several factors have pointed to a coming armed conflict between the two nations. The buildup of troops along the border, the passing of winter ready for a campaigning season in spring, and the closing window of opportunity for Russia to subdue Ukraine before it becomes too firmly entrenched in the Western sphere of influence with its application to join the EU and NATO. However, talks have been ongoing, and it's possible that these maneuvers were simply designed to give Russia a stronger hand at the negotiating table. It certainly wouldn't be the first time that it's played this card. The longer Russian troops wait at the border, the more preparation, intelligence, and support from Western countries Ukraine receives. The potential for a war with the fellow Slavic nation of Ukraine remains unpopular among the Russian public.
something the savvy President Putin is well aware of. And there hasn't been anything like the propaganda campaign engaged in on Russian state media, as was seen in the run-up to the annexation of Crimea in 2014. Nonetheless, the current situation certainly requires our attention, and only time will tell how Russia and Ukraine can resolve their differences.
First of all, I'm not gonna comment anything regarding my thoughts regarding the situation, regarding the conflict. I'm not gonna take that in consideration at all. It's a hot potato. Even in Sweden, it's a hot potato. We got troops in Sweden as well. I mean, everyone knows it's not like it's something you can hide. Mobilizing here as well, but it's an ongoing conflict, and let's all pray to God Almighty that there's no armed war. Let them settle this by paper. We don't need more blood. It's enough. I'm going to wrap it up. It's been a long video. I really enjoyed this. I feel like I got information I want and I need. And if you did enjoy, smack the like and hit that subscribe. Take it easy in the comment section and take care of yourself. And we'll see you next time.